First, I wanted to point out just one connection to another speaker later in the conference, and that's Mark Emanuel from David Webb. And I thought it might be interesting to start with this contemporary image of the model Caroline Murphy showing off some of the productions of the company, David Webb. And you'll hear about the extraordinary reinvigoration of David Webb Jewelers tomorrow from Mark. But I just wanted to begin with this image because I think this is our, if you like, this is our standard image of the allure of gold. It's associated with beauty, possibly with sex, and certainly with desire in a general sense. And we see it here not in its raw state, but obviously in its transformed state in the accompaniment of other precious materials, diamonds, other rare stones, enamel, and the like. But to make these objects, and here's a historical necklace by David Webb, to make these objects, of course, requires absolutely intense levels of skill. And I was very struck visiting David Webb's workshop, which is on Madison Avenue, right across from the Whitney Museum of Art. I think hardly anybody knows that it's there. As they walk past on Madison Avenue, you see storefront after storefront. Right, exactly. It's right above the showroom. And what you don't know, maybe even if you go and purchase an object there, what you don't know is that upstairs there are people making these objects. In fact, 25 absolutely extraordinary craftspeople from all over the world, from China, from Japan, from here in the United States, from Italy, from France, all working together to realize these objects. Gem setters, metalsmiths, finishers, enamelists, carvers, model makers, people who use digital tools even to realize these extraordinary objects. And so on the one hand, one can look at an image like that magazine advertisement and say, right, that's the power of gold, that's the allure of gold, that's how it exerts a pull on our imagination through these associations with other forms of desire. But I'm more interested, as the director of a museum that really specializes in making, specializes in skill, specializes in the way that craftspeople infuse the world around us with meaning, I'm more interested in the motivations that lie behind that shiny facade of desire. I'm more interested in the motivations of those 25 extraordinary workmen and women. I'm more interested in the motivations of someone like Mark Emanuel. As I say, you'll hear from him tomorrow, and what would motivate someone like him to invest his own time and ingenuity in, if you like, bringing this brand back and making it into a viable 21st century operation. So that's just to say that my remarks this morning are in general couched in a broader consideration of how materials encounter individual people's lives, not only the people that wear gold jewelry, but also the people that make it. And so for me, it's a question of how that imaginative power works to connect individuals. And this, I think, is perhaps why it has been such contested terrain. So now diving into my talk proper and beginning to suggest some of the many historical points of reference that one can consider when thinking about gold. I thought, as I say, I could have gone back even further to the ancient world, pre-Columbian jewelry, ancient Chinese bronzes inlaid with gold, obviously the great things coming down to us from Greece and the Cyclades. But I thought I would start comparatively more recently with Thomas More and his great manifesto or tract Utopia, literally no place, from 1516. And I'm not sure how many of you will have run across this, but there's a wonderful passage in More's Utopia where he's talking about the way that the inhabitants of this perfect civilization, which has achieved absolute equality and political harmony, an island off in an unnamed ocean, talks about the way that gold is used in that culture. And I think you can probably read it. He says that the chamber pots in this beautiful, perfect city are made of gold. And also, they use gold to make the chains of the slaves. Notice that in 1516, even the perfect, harmonious city had slaves. This tells you a lot about the political climate of the time. And also, as a badge of infamy, you would wear a gold earring. So, of course, what More is doing here is inverting the value of his own culture. And I think it's hilarious to look at this passage next to Hans Holbein's portrait of Moore, where of course he has a gold chain on, as well as a gold ring, so not practicing what he preaches. But of course the idea here is that this perfect, obviously fictional, perfect civilization decides to place gold in the least prestigious contexts as an object to use for the toilet, as decoration for slaves, in order to discourage people from overly fetishizing, overly valuing what is in fact only a material. It's not something that's actually, in big scare quotes, of any value. And what Moore is saying, essentially, in what is almost a very, very early critique of capitalism, what Moore is saying is that if you have a material that's valued above all else, then inevitably it becomes a way for people to come in conflict with one another. But if we take a step back from that position, we can say that, of course, what's really happening here is that Moore is using gold for symbolic purposes as a way to try to make a political point. And it's a pattern that you see again and again, not just in European cultures, but in other cultures as well. A great story that I'll tell you has to do with the artist Ogata Korin, who's Japanese, living around the same time as Moore, in fact, in the early 16th century in Japan. And the story is that Korin, who was an artist of a kind of middle-class background in Japan, in Kyoto, but with many aristocratic patrons who would buy his extraordinary screen paintings, like the one that you see here from the Metropolitan Collection, and other objects of his creativity, ceramics, prints, and so on. Korin was always in the presence of these aristocratic samurai patrons, but there were very tightly enforced laws at that time as far as what you could wear, depending on your class. So Ogata Korin, being from a mercantile or middle-class background, was, for example, not allowed to wear gold cloth and not allowed to wear other forms of extremely conspicuous display, and same for the objects that he would have had in his home, whereas his samurai patrons, of course, could, and therefore they could buy these objects. So according to this so-called sumptuary legislation, Korin literally could not own the objects that he himself was making. So the story is that Korin went down to the riverside with some of his patrons, and they had a picnic together. And as you probably all know, in Japan, a picnic is quite a luxurious affair. You have those wonderful boxes with all the trays and so on. So everyone brings their own box. Of course, all of his patrons have these gorgeous lacquer containers for their food. The food itself is exquisitely prepared. There's gold and silver decoration on the boxes. They're all unpacking their food and so on. And Korin is sitting there very quietly with a plain bamboo box, absolutely no decoration whatsoever, very sober, very appropriate for a man of lower stature, lower social stature. And so when the other patrons have finished unwrapping their lunch, Korin begins to unwrap his, and so he opens his bamboo box, and inside are his morsels of food, each one individually wrapped with a piece of gold leaf. And as he eats, he unwraps each piece of food and throws the gold leaf into the water where it drifts down the current. Isn't that beautiful? And of course, he's making a point there that's analogous in some ways, although very much more poetically put, very much analogous to what Moore is saying around the same time. Perhaps we should think of gold not as something to set ourselves in a rigid structure with regard to one another, the wealthier above the less wealthy, but perhaps we should experience it purely aesthetically. Perhaps we should use it to articulate our relationships with one another in an imaginative and artistic way, and therefore it's quite appropriate that the greatest use in Japan of this material, despite the use of gold leaf on screens and so on, is in fact as a material to repair broken objects. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this tradition, which is called kintsugi. And this is a tea bowl, which is in fact by Honami Koetsu, who was a close associate of Korin's. And as you can see, it's a tea bowl that was very highly prized for its asymmetrical, beautiful manufacture, but then, of course, befell some incident and was absolutely lovingly repaired with lacquer that is then sheathed in a gold surface. if you like, making the accidental, making the breakage, making something horrible, making something heartbreaking into something beautiful, poetic, elevating. And it's often said that the objects that have been repaired in this way are in fact more valued and more beloved than the objects that never broke in the first place. So there you get, again, a wonderful sense of how gold can be used to articulate value in a way that's perhaps not so straightforward. It's a way of highlighting something that is perhaps upsetting or some kind of disruption in this object, and then making it into a kind of poetic encounter. Going back to Europe, and again, a couple of 100 years forward, I thought it might also be interesting to show you this image by Hogarth. Again, probably familiar to you. It's the second painting of the cycle, Marriage à la Mode, and this shows the young aristocratic gentleman and his new wife in their debauched splendor. So this is the morning after, if you like, and so they're exhausted, as you can see, and there is their clerk exiting stage left with his fistfuls of unpaid bills. And you can also see around the place various tchotchkes and paintings and fine furniture that they can't afford. And of course, much of it is gold. So you see gold. Sorry, the slide's maybe not as clear as it could be, but you see gold leaf on the legs of the footstool that the dog is perching on the capitals of the columns, of course the frames of the painting, and of course absolutely splashed all over the gentleman himself, all of his gold finery. Just one little side note about this painting, which I've always found interesting, is that footstools, or ottomans, were not actually used in Britain in the 18th century. They were considered to be a French thing because English gentlemen did not put their feet up because it was seen to be a sign of a sort of decadence. And so the fact that Hogarth has very conspicuously had the gentleman sticking out his legs in this very unrefined fashion with a footstool a la Francais right there is highly pointed. And again, you probably can't see this, but his heels are red, and that was a sign of French aristocracy in the 18th century. That's the reason that Christian Louboutin's shoes are red on the underside. It's a reference to that tradition. And there was another sumptuary law in France. Only the aristocracy were allowed to wear red heels. So it's not just gold, it's also other things, but gold, of course, is the thing that we immediately think of. And so you can see all of the gold in this picture is again being used for moralistic purposes, very much like Moore or possibly like Corinne. Gold is being used here not only to highlight the desire of these people, but also in some sense to condemn it. However, all this being said, gold is a means by which people articulate their relationships to one another. And I suppose the thing that we, of course, always think about here is the wedding ring. Anyone who has gotten married has had to think about this. Should we have a ring? If so, what should it be like? And almost everybody ends up with a gold ring in the end. This is a particularly wonderful one made by Paul Revere, the great American patriot, silver and goldsmith. And I thought it might be worth pointing out that not only does the MFA Boston have this wonderful wedding ring that was made for, I believe, his daughter, but also they have a mourning ring, also made by Revere for a client, not for a member of his family, as you can see, Reverend Samuel Dunbar. And I think it's worth pointing out that the gold jewelry inserts itself into people's lives, not only at moments of celebration, but also at moments that are more melancholic, moments of mourning, moments of tragedy. And so these two objects, if you like, mark different stages of life. And despite all of the doubt and the suspicion that circulates around gold as the ultimate exemplar of value, of course, when we really need to signify importance to ourselves and to our loved ones, it's inevitably the thing that we reach out for. Here's just another example. This is from the V&A collection. I think a beautiful, beautiful example of a gold pin that has the locks of a loved one inside this beautiful, delicate case with a glass lens on it. And here the gold as a raw material and the hair as another kind of raw material are being equated in some way, both of them equally being presented for their emotional affect, and the swirling of the hair and the swirling of the gold seem to echo one another in this very beautiful way. Now, the 19th century in general is a fascinating time when it comes to gold and the way that people thought about it. A very interesting political context in which this arises is in Berlin, particularly in Prussia, in the early 19th century, but also elsewhere in Germany, when the war effort that was then underway became sloganized in relationship to the materials gold and iron. And the slogan here is, "I gave gold for iron," Gold gab ich für Eisen. The idea here is that again, the aristocracy, generally the wealthier inhabitants of Prussia, would turn in their gold as a patriotic gesture, as a contribution to the war effort, and in return, as it were, they would decorate themselves with iron jewelry instead. This is actually an echo of that tradition from 1914, because the same process was repeated during the First World War. But here's an early 19th century belt buckle that, believe it or not, is made entirely of cast iron. And this happened because of the patriotic upswell of symbolic resonance, not only for gold, but also for this metal that in some ways was seen to be its antithesis. Gold, the bright, precious, delicate material, and iron, the dark, heavy, industrial material. And it's a very German story, isn't it? But also German, perhaps, is the very technical, the very masterful technical work that was in fact developed during this time by various artists and designers, including the architect Friedrich Schinkel, that allowed iron manufacturers to exploit this patriotic ideal and create objects of absolutely astonishing delicacy and beauty out of cast iron, which had previously been reserved, as I say, primarily for architectural and engineering uses, bridges and the like. But gold in general does go through an absolutely enormous revival and intense investment from designers, decorators, craftspeople of all kinds in the 19th century. A big part of that, of course, is the Gothic revival. And these are just two chalices, one French on the left, English on the right, that show the way that this material is used in the middle of the 19th century. Of course, acknowledging and looking back to the medieval tradition, but if anything, improving on its craft techniques. And one thing I just want to say as a little bit of an aside, and this is really what my book, Invention of Craft, is about, is that the 19th century has a bad reputation among art historians as the period of time when craft is sort of wiped out by the Industrial Revolution. But in fact, nothing could be further from the case. In fact, there are many, many more very skilled craftspeople active, let's say in Britain, the home of the Industrial Revolution, many more craftspeople in 1850 than in 1750, much better trained, much more aware of historical and global influences and traditions, and much higher skills, in fact. But of course, there's become a discourse about craft in relation to the machine, and there's a problem that has evolved from the juxtaposition of these two things, mass manufacture on the one hand and craftsmanship on the other hand, so that craft is often put in this kind of backward-looking position. So the Gothic revival being a perfect example of that. Ultimately, what this leads to, sorry, here's just one other example. I just wanted to put this in because I thought it was such an amazing object. It's a gilt copy of a medieval reliquary. So originally this would have been an actual medieval object holding probably the bone of the arm of a saint. But it's been recreated here, and a Hungarian object recreated here in gilt metal, electrotyped, so sort of chemically reproduced and then gilt. At any rate, I just wanted to show you that little waving hand. But ultimately what this leads to, of course, is William Morris. And Morris firmly takes the side, or the position, that craft has to be this kind of act of preservation, that the medieval culture of Europe was highly preferable to the contemporary culture of Europe, which had been ruined, he thought, by industrialism and capitalism. He's, of course, a very politicized man, very staunch socialist, and he takes, again, a very, very emphatic stance against preciousness. So echoes here of Thomas More, echoes of Hogarth's portrait of the debauched aristocracy. And I think this quote, which is from a text about socialism, is absolutely powerful. You know, the artificial famine of inequality impoverishes us despite our riches. So he's saying we have gold, we have wealth, but what we lack is human egalitarianism. But sure enough, Morris himself was hardly immune to the allure of gold, and I was absolutely amused to find this object, which is a little locket of Morris's hair in a gold case, made by one of his adherents, one of the followers of the arts and crafts movement. And as you know, the arts and crafts movement itself, and Lisa has done many conferences on this subject, the arts and crafts movement is a great moment for the rediscovery of metalworking techniques and the ongoing process of development of art made of precious materials. So Morris, who often complained that his own products, furniture, tapestries, ceramics, wallpaper, everything that he was making, he often would complain that he was simply making decorations for what he called the swinish rich, that he himself was not immune to this allure and was somehow trapped in the kind of emotional tide pool that I've been trying to describe. So what happens in the 20th century? Well, you would think that in some ways modernism would be completely opposed to gold as a material, that it would have no place in the avant-garde. Of course, this is far from the truth. Preciousness continues to be extremely important in the progression of art in the 20th century. One thinks, of course, of an artist like Gustav Klimt, the great portrait of Adele Bauer that's at the Neue Gallery here in New York. Just as an example of that, the absolutely splendid, lavish usage of gold leaf and other precious materials in his work. Even at the Bauhaus, gold finds a place. This is, I think, one of the most hilarious objects in the history of jewelry by Nam Slutsky. When I say hilarious, that's obviously a deadpan form of hilarity, but it's a rigid, geometric, rationalist object made by Slutsky in the goldsmithing workshops of the Bauhaus. So the sine qua non of reductive jewelry design, but of course it's gilt. So that you have this nod even here in the most abstract and reduced forms of jewelry being produced by these hyper-logical modernists. Even here you have a place for gold. And then coming up to more contemporary times, we have, of course, Andy Warhol, maybe the most witty and ironic use of gold in 20th century art, the gold Marilyn here from the Museum of Modern Art collection, where celebrity and its shiny affect is somehow analogized to the allure and glitz and glamour of gold as a material. To more recent artists like Mark Quinn, this is a piece called Sphinx, which is the very recognizable Kate Moss, who's been contorted into the pose of a kind of yoga master. I guess that she can't actually do this. But it is a real pose that was assumed by a professional contortionist, and then Quinn set Kate Moss's very impassive, beautiful, serene head on the top of this absolutely extraordinary pretzel-like configuration of limbs. Moss here being presented as a kind of religious icon of the 21st century, maybe the only thing that popular culture seems to be able to subscribe to with total enthusiasm is a supermodel. And of course, only one material would do for this kind of object, referring not only to the history of precious objects in Europe, but also to the tradition of Buddhist sculpture. And I feel that in some ways the religious allusion or reference here is extremely explicit. She is like a Buddha or some kind of Hindu deity with multiple limbs, something that we worship in some way without quite knowing exactly what could be in her mind as she stares at us with this kind of dead expression. So gold had to be involved here, you could say. Only gold would have the power to conjure this form of distance and the power of celebrity. But I thought I would conclude with one last artist, or in fact a pair of artists and their relationship to one another, because I think that when thinking about this topic, it's awfully easy to get carried away by these discussions of money and wealth and power and desire and jealousy that I've been talking about. And those are unavoidable associations if one thinks about the emotional matrix that that arises from gold as a material. But as I said when I was talking about Paul Revere, gold also seems to have an irresistible and inevitable relationship to human emotion of a really pure and simple form, a form that we can all identify with. Love, mourning, the recognition of these moments in our lives. And so I thought I would end with this, a pair of pieces. This one is by Felix Gonzalez Torres, a wonderful artist here in New York who very tragically died of AIDS, along with his lover, Ross, in the early 1990s. And just before he died, he made this piece in tribute to another artist named Ronnie Horn, a great friend of his, German artist. And he created this portrait of her by amassing a huge field of little candies that were wrapped in gold foil, gold, a material that Ronnie Horn had used a lot in her work. And the rule here is that the public could come and simply take a candy away with them, unwrap it, eat it, and somehow ingest or imbibe some of the spirit of this artist that Felix Gonzalez Torres was trying to create in this abstract portrait. And I think there's something really interesting here about Felix Gonzalez Torres' use of that modernist, rigid, geometric form that we saw on the Nam Slutsky piece, which he somehow infused again with emotional affect. Well, when Felix and his partner Ross did pass away, Ronnie Horn in turn made a portrait of them, which looks like this. If I can get the slide to come. Oops. It couldn't be simpler. It's just two sheets of gold leaf, uninterrupted sheafs, you could say, of gold leaf, lying one on top of the other. And it's simply a portrait of the two men as they had been in life. And you can see, of course, that Ronnie Horn here is echoing Felix Gonzalez's portrait of her and returning it in like form. But she's also given us a portrait of love, really, of these two lives that were pressed close together, touching in many places, but also, of course, pulling away from one another slightly, as you can see at the edge there, because of the sort of wrinkling irregularity of the two sheets of leaf. And I think it's a reminder, again, of the power of the artistic imagination to transform our relationship to the world around us. You remember that lump of gold that I showed you at the beginning of my talk from the Natural History Museum, and it does have this kind of amazingness to it, the amazingness of nature and what's created in the earth, but it lacks any sense of human involvement. And this to me is a perfect example of how human creativity can engage materials like this, leaving them in this case actually quite similar to their, quite close to their raw state, simply hammered flat, hammered very, very, very thin, paper thin. But then through the creation of this very simple symbolic gesture can remind us of how strongly we associate to one another as humans through bonds of love, and the way that gold so often can be the binding agent that helps us understand what that means to us. So that's what I would like to say to you this morning, and I think we do have time for a couple of questions if you'd like to offer any, but thank you very much for your attention. And if there are any questions, I think you probably should use the microphones at the side of the auditorium. Maybe later. Okay. Thanks all very much, and I wish you a good morning.